Hello and welcome to the Wildly Known Life podcast. I'm Nikki Hardy, your host and favourite fresh air junkie. And here on the Wildly Known Life podcast, we connect science, faith and wonder to help all us spiritually underwhelmed, grown-up humans of the world say yes to that sacred tug within. Because if you feel closest to God in nature, and you're looking for biblically sound, nature-based spiritual practices that move beyond a prayer walk around the block or thanking God for stunning sunsets, you are in the right place. Because we believe that soul tug you can feel is God's invitation to reconnect with Him, yourself, and who you're created to be. Each week we weave story, scripture, and science into prayers and practices you can carry into the woods, your morning routine, or a regular Tuesday afternoon. My goal is for you to walk away feeling energized, equipped, and ready to say yes to that sacred tug within, so you can find more of what God has for you and you've been longing for. Together, we'll listen to God, our souls, and what His sacred creation has to say as we allow ourselves to be and live wildly known. Okay, let's dive in. Last week, I talked about how getting out in nature helps us hear God's voice, and we unpacked some of the brain science as to why that is. But if you're like most of us, trying to hear God's voice is as slippery as a baby seal on a slip and slide, and often leaves us frustrated and asking, God, why can't I hear you? The first time I heard someone talking about hearing God's voice was a woman at church in our church in London. And she'd been invited up onto the stage by the vicar, and she was talking about how she was going to go to India to be a missionary and how God had called her and spoken to her and talked her into doing this. And she talked like they were having a cup of tea, her and God, or maybe they were on the phone. She kept saying, well, God said this to me. And then I said, God, I'm not going to India. And he said, oh, yes, you are. Let me show you how it's going to work. And she said, but then I said, I haven't got the money for that. And then God said, and she just kept going on and on as if they were best buds. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, how does this work? They're not exactly in the same room. Is he speaking with an audible voice? How does she know it's him and not her? I mean, is this just wishful thinking? And the thing was, I really wanted to hear God's voice. I wanted to hear him tell me that he loves me. I wanted to hear his wisdom and know his comfort and the direction for my life, just like she did. And like I said, it didn't take me long to just keep asking that question, why can't I hear God? And now, having spoken to hundreds of people and talked with so many about hearing God's voice, one thing I know is a lot of thoughtful, faithful people, just like you and me, quietly wonder why they can't hear God. And if they do think maybe they hear something, they're quick to dismiss it. They say, oh, it's just me, or it's just wishful thinking. You see, we so often assume that God speaks to other people. You know, Julie, she's far more spiritual than I am. She color codes her Bible. And Wendy, oh my goodness, Wendy spends hours journaling on her wanderings in the woods. They hear God's voice, but not me. Or maybe occasionally something stands out to me in the Bible, or a verse that strikes me while I'm digging the vegetables, or I get this thought that feels very un-me. But for the most part, hearing God's voice remains a struggle. We assume something's wrong with us or we're doing it wrong. So let me ask you, what if struggling to hear God's voice doesn't mean he's not speaking to you? What if it didn't mean you're not able to hear him? Because I believe he is speaking and you can hear him. What if hearing God's voice is about learning to tune into that voice, like tuning an old car radio where you turn the dial to get a clearer and clearer signal and frequency, and finally the song became crystal clear? Maybe it's about that. Maybe it's about tuning into his voice. And there's one simple mindset shift that's all you need to get better at that tuning in and recognizing his voice. Now, I'm not going to add guilt or shame or anything else to your already kind of heavy shoulders about hearing God's voice. And I'm not going to give you a 3-step process to do it. Although I do have some science and brain science backed tools I use sometimes, and I'll tell you about them at another time. But rather today, what I want to do is offer an invitation, a posture, a mindset shift to help us. If you've listened to episode 1, where I talk about the brain science of how getting outdoors helps us hear God's voice, you'll remember the story of when I felt God stop me in my tracks, mid-run, and speak to me, not audibly, but he spoke about how I was dealing with, or not dealing with, the miscarriages we'd been suffering. It was a reminder to us all that he's our shepherd, and as his kids, as his sheep, we can hear his voice. It might just take a bit of tuning into, of learning to recognize it and looking out for it. It's what we call discernment, but discernment isn't easy. And today, like I said, the focus is on one mindset shift, a posture we can adopt to hear God's voice a little easier. And that mindset shift, that posture, is a posture of expectation. And I have a confession to make. For the longest time, I didn't expect God to speak to me. I expected silence. That was what I expected to hear. Now, it's winter, it's the beginning of January, the trees are bare, and often when I walk Charlie, all is still and quiet. In winter, that's what we expect, isn't it? We expect it to be quiet and still outside. We don't expect the hum of bees buzzing around, a dawn chorus of birdsong to wake us up and greet us when we're out in the woods. For the most part, it's quiet, and we expect quiet. And when we walk through life with our minds stuck in the belief that we can't hear God and that he doesn't speak to us, with this story playing on repeat in our brains, it's like walking into a winter forest, silent with snow, where it all seems like nothing is moving, and seeing and hearing exactly what we're expecting. Nothing. But in reality, if we stop and we start to look around, and we stop stomping through the snow and we are quiet for just a moment, and we take time to listen, we notice a few hidden birds who haven't migrated to warmer climes high in the treetops. We notice the wind whispering through the pines, the dripping of snow glistening, and the creaking of tree limbs under the weight of last night's snowfall. Life and movement are already there. And next time we head out into the woodland silence, we'll expect to see and hear far more, maybe even a winter fox. Struggling to hear God's voice doesn't mean he isn't speaking. More often than not, it simply means we're walking through life not expecting him to speak, not expecting to hear him, even if he does. Do you remember the story of young Samuel? It takes place in the Bible in 1 Samuel chapter 3. Having been promised to God by his mother Hannah, young Samuel goes to live and serve God in the temple alongside the priest Eli. Bless his heart, little Samuel. He must probably have only been about 3 or 4 years old when he went. And one night, Eli and Samuel are asleep, and Samuel hears a voice calling him, "Samuel, Samuel!" Eli's eyesight is failing, so Samuel rushes to Eli's side and says, "Yes, I heard you, I'm here." Now, Eli's fast asleep. And then when he wakes up, probably a little frustrated, he tells Samuel just to go back to sleep because he didn't call him. Now, all this happens 3 times more. God calling Samuel, Samuel rushing to Eli, telling him he's heard him and he's there for him, and Eli telling Samuel it wasn't him and to go back to bed. On the 3rd time, Eli realizes it's probably God speaking and tells Samuel to go back to bed, and if the voice calls again, to say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." What I find really interesting is that at the beginning of the chapter, we learn that this was a time in the Jewish people's history when the revelation of God was rarely heard or seen. That's what it says. In other words, no one had heard from God in a really long time. No wonder Eli wasn't expecting that voice to be God's. But by telling Samuel to listen out for the voice once more and answer God if he heard it, he exchanged that mindset of not expecting to hear from God and gave Samuel the expectation that God would speak and does speak, and Samuel could hear him. Until that moment, Samuel only expected to hear Eli's voice, not God's. Expectation doesn't make God speak. It helps us notice that he already is. John Wimber used to say, when he began to start leaning into trying to listen to God's voice, he would say, "It's probably me, but it could be God." And then after years and years of listening for the Lord, he would say, "It's probably God, but it might be me." And I just love that. Expectation isn't confidence in our ability, it's trust in his promise to speak and that we can hear. Expectation and the way we walk through life changes everything. That lady who went off to India, she knew she was one of God's sheep. She knew she was in the sheep pen and Jesus would and does speak. She knew she could hear her shepherd's voice. Not perfectly, no, but over time, she knew she could tune in to what he was saying and along with others, discern the right way to go, which for her was good to go off to India. She lived expectant, trusting God to speak over her ability to hear. Trusting God to make it clear if she didn't quite hear right the first time. Her posture was one of expectation. It wasn't a posture of striving, of forcing, of demanding, of performance. Expectation is a quiet openness that says, God, I believe you're here. You're speaking and I can hear your voice. Just as we can't force or demand a silent winter forest to produce its sounds and wonders, neither can we force God to speak. But we can enter the forest expectant, with our eyes and ears turned and tuned to the sights and sound we'd miss otherwise. If you're like me, you've often asked God to speak and then listened, but with a guarded heart, braced for disappointment. It's like, Lord, speak to me, but I know I'm not going to hear anything. Not only does that make it really hard for us to hear, but anything we think we might have heard, we quickly dismiss because we've already told ourselves he's not going to speak. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of silence. So my invitation to us all is to step into our week with a posture of expectation, one that's hope-filled, trusting, eager, laced with grace to get it wrong, grace to give it a go, and a willingness to lean in. We're going to end, as we always do, with a simple, embodied, repeatable practice you can take into your day. And I want to invite you to get out in nature somehow. It doesn't have to be a wilderness. Your local park bench will do. Or if getting outside is a struggle, simply sitting in your favorite armchair with some flowers or a potted plant nearby is great. Maybe pause the episode if you need to do that, to get outside. It's our hearts we're connecting with nature just as much as our body. And we're going to take a moment to prepare our hearts and minds to welcome God and ask him to speak. And so, as we take time to be with God now, let's rest a moment in stillness, returning our wandering minds to his presence and responding with openness. We're going to take a moment to slow our bodies. Notice your breath. Maybe take a few inhales and exhales. I like to visualize breathing the breath of life in and exhaling all my worries and my frustrations as I do. Inhale the breath of life, exhale our worries. And then we're going to ask God to raise our expectations that he'll speak and we'll be able to listen. Take a moment to say to God, "Here I am, Lord, your servant is listening." Maybe repeat it a few times. "Here I am, Lord, your servant is listening." And then let's just sit in quiet stillness. Not for a message, but just for his presence. Maybe a thought will come to mind. Maybe you'll see something, a lyric, a scripture, a metaphor from something around you. And I want to encourage you to write down what you think you might be hearing. As John Wimber said, what if it's God? It's probably me, but it could be God. So, why can't I hear God? Well, often it's an inner narrative that has been laced and guided by disappointments that teach us to expect silence. So, can we reframe it to say, I can hear God? He is speaking. Jesus is my shepherd and I am his sheep. I'm going to walk through my day expectant. Okay, friends. Thanks for spending time with me on the Wildly Known Life podcast. Before you go, remember, sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is to step outside, take a breath, drop our shoulders, they're not earrings, and ask what our wildly wonderful God has to say. That's where coming alive in our life and faith begins, and living wildly known follows. If that hits home, be sure, as always, to subscribe, leave a quick review, and share this episode with a friend who's tired of feeling spiritually underwhelmed and is ready for more. And don't forget, we would love to see you inside the Wildly Known Life community over on Substack. And the link to get there and to become part of that is in the show notes. It's a vibrant, down-to-earth gathering for honest talk, practical tools, and deeper connection. Because God didn't design any of us to do this wildlife alone. Okay, see you next time, my friend. And remember, live wildly known.